I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for coming. Today's presentation is really going to be about data. So bicycle pedestrian counting, data, what we can do with it, what we do with it, and hopefully by the time you leave here today, you'll get some good ideas to take back to your communities with how to count and what to do with those counts. So our presentation is going to be broken up into 4 different parts. First, Dr. Mike Lowry is going to be talking about some work that he's been doing over in Washington regarding both portable, permanent, and manual counts. I will then get into a discussion about what we do here in the Valley with our manual count program, and that will be then tied right into Duane from Compass, who's going to be talking more about the portable count program that they do. After that, for our second phase, we'll take it to the streets, walk down, and check out a couple counters that we currently have installed, so you'll be able to actually get your hands on a few of these, see how they work, what are the pros to those, what are the cons, and hopefully get some ideas to take back with you. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it off to Mike to lead the way.
Great. All right, thanks everyone. So I am going to be talking in large part today about a report that I just finished up for the Washington State Department of Transportation. I have a hard copy if anyone wants to look at this. And this was wow, there we go. This was a report I did with them in collaboration with a few other researchers. I'll describe that and I'll also describe a web page that we created as part of the project. So first, let me get into this guidebook and tell you about it. So the table of contents is divided into, first, some background on traffic monitoring. So I'm going to sort of follow my presentation today with that same sort of sequence. I'll give some background on traffic monitoring, and then I'm going to talk about the focus of the report, which is on where and when to count. And this was aimed at manual counts, so volunteer programs or paid staff, however that might be, but by people out there counting. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the recommendations that we put in the report. And then I'll finish up with the website, which is described in the appendix of this report, which is available online, by the way. Okay, so let's do some background on traffic monitoring, just by the raise of your hands. Who are engineers in here? Okay, so not many, but maybe some of the planners too are aware of how this is normally done. So with cars, this is easier to focus on because it's maybe more familiar. We have permanent counters that are installed on the roadways, and they are often inductive loops so that they detect the vehicles going over, and there's usually a box there that many people don't notice, but it's there and it's spread throughout the state of Idaho. My presentation is mostly going to talk about Washington because I did this report for Washington. This is the state of Washington and their permanent counters for automobiles throughout the state. So let's play a little game here, like the gumdrops the candies in a jar. How many permanent counters do you think they have there throughout the state? And it might be easier to look at this way. 215. Another guess? 80, 100, 193. So that's pretty good. All right, does anyone know what's happening? Oh, it's because this is on. Can we turn that one off?
That one is too.
Is there a way to turn those off?
I don't know. Oh yeah, slide it down.
So, how are those permanent counters used? So look at the red dot, that would be a permanent counter. And then the blue dots are what are called short duration coverage counts, and they cover a larger area. And then the permanent counters, they develop what's called continuous data. And so the short duration coverage counts are what we often see. We drive over these tubes that are spread out throughout the area. And then what you can do with those short duration counts is you and surprisingly to some people, those tubes are usually only put up for 2 to 3 days, and the way to do it is Tuesday to Thursday. They usually don't do it on the weekends, but they do some 2 to 3 day window, Tuesday to Thursday, and then you average that out, and that's called ADT, average daily traffic. And then the permanent counts, meanwhile, is counting 24/7, 365 continuously, and so it gets AADT, so you add another A to it, and that's a different thing then. Theoretically, it's the total count in both directions divided by 365. I say theoretically because no machine is perfect. It often has errors, so there's a little bit of manipulation that has to be done with the data to get AADT. And then what you can do is, with that coverage count, which was not expensive to install, was portable, able to cover a large area, you do a conversion factor because you had this variation, and then you get an estimated ADT at now many, many more locations. So why are we doing that? Well, because of the variation that happens. So this is again Washington. This is up in a rural area, and you can see a peak in the summertime, right? So if you did your count, your coverage count, anytime during the year, it's not going to be representative of the full year because if you did it in June, it was a high count. If you did it in January, it's a low count. So the tubes that were going around need to be adjusted. Here's showing just a different pattern. This is more urban area over in Bellevue. And so here are the coverage counts that the state of Washington does. So again, let's get a guess. How many do you think that is?
1,000.
1,000 I'm hearing. 1,400. And maybe it's easier to see like that. Okay, so it's 3,643. And that's their coverage count program. And they do about 1,200 a year. So it's a 3-year rotation that they're getting through the whole system to get every coverage count. And because of time, I'm not going to show, but they have this nicely on a web page. You can download the data, and you can also get the adjustment factors and see how they're doing all of that. Why are these counts needed? Well, whoever chose the title of our session today had that great saying, if it's not counted, it doesn't count, right? Well, data is needed for so many things. It's needed at the facility level, so that's the specific roadways to prioritize projects, to design improvements, do any type of crash analysis. It's just not possible at all without some understanding of what they call exposure, which is the number of cars that are traveling there. Or in our case, we're going to talk about bikes. You can see there's a map of Seattle with a traffic flow map that's done completely, and I cut that out of my presentation today too because I want to shorten it up here. But I had in my previous presentation also Seattle's count program, and they have permanent counters. The city does, and then they have local counts. Okay, and then the other thing that count data is used for is just generally statewide information, citywide, mode-wide. Okay, so let's talk about bicycle traffic monitoring. It's the same thing. It should be the same anyway. You need permanent counters, PTRs, and then you can do your coverage counts. And the nature of bicycling is such that often it's manual counts, but Boise's working quite hard to do portable counters that are also doing coverage short duration counts, which is all the better because the longer you can be out there, the better. But the key is to have a few PTRs. Our report talks more about the traffic monitoring guide, which is a complete description of how this process works. And one of the key elements to that is this idea that there's different ways to do for bicycling short duration coverage counts, from the more permanent inductive loop. Sort of strange because it's like behind me. I want to point at things like this or something. But from the more the inductive loops down to the more temporary manual observations. Okay, so let's look at the state of Washington's bicycle count program. PTRs, how many do you think that is? These are bicycle PTRs in the state of Washington. That's pretty good, 25. And they've just added, they're really aggressively pushing it at their state level. They've just added 15. And this is not counting ones that cities have. So here in Idaho, as far as I understand, I don't believe ITD maintains any PTRs. And there are few, we're going to hear more about some of the PTRs that are here in Boise. But other than that, there's not many in the state of Idaho. But Washington, 25. And then just like with cars, we have some variation. So here are some monthly variation that we see at those PTRs in the state of Washington, and at any PTR here in town, we'd be seeing the same thing. Recreation, high volumes in the summer, lower in the winter. but the commute maybe not as pronounced with that variation. Here's the day of week variation. It's pretty typical pattern that you see with bicycling is Mondays are usually low, Fridays are also low. People want to drive on Friday so they can get out quicker maybe. And then, sorry, for recreation, they're not driving. Well, actually, Friday's low for the commute and for the recreation, and then recreation high on the weekends, commute location low on the weekends. And I believe all the PTRs in Boise are on the trail, so probably a lot of recreation type travel, but I haven't looked at the data. Hour of day variation, recreation location usually is a single peak, whereas commute locations are 2 peaks, morning and evening. So you need to have those PTR, because if you do your count at any point, you need to be able to adjust it properly. Here are the coverage counts for the state of Washington. Guess there? It's 280 locations so Washington State DOT sponsors a count program. They're actually one of the few, I mean, we shouldn't be too jealous because they're actually one of the only ones in the country that does do that, but it's a good thing to look at as our neighbor, and something that ITD should hopefully will consider one day is to help sponsor that. For time, I won't go to this, but their counts are also all online for bicycle and pedestrian, and you can download their data. So in the report that we developed, we wanted to make some recommendations to their program, and one of the key things was about where and when to count. So I'm going to go through that quickly now. One of the first questions is that you're faced with is, should you count at an intersection or should you count at between intersections? So if you count between intersections, it's called a screen line count. And if you count at the intersection, that's called a cordon line count. The cordon line is that circle that's going around there. And, okay. So let's break that down even more. Here is sort of a schematic of it. So a screen line count. And then at the intersection, you actually have options now. If you're going to do an intersection count, you can do a 12 movement count, you could do a 4 movement leaving, or a 4 entering, or a 4 movement leaving. And in this report, and again, I won't go into the details, but we told Washington DOT to stop doing what they're doing because they've been doing a 4 movement leaving. And I don't think I go into that here, but I can discuss it if you want with questions, but it's not a good idea. The best methods are these two, and we also did some with this project and a previous project. We had a group of volunteers. We randomly assigned them to count at busy intersections. We looked at the error that occurs, and we did find that a 12 movement count there is more error, but it wasn't significant. But what we found with the screen line count is the ability to add on additional information, such as helmet use or male or female. And when we added that onto the 12 movement count, it was with greater error. So in the end, our recommendation was use these two, preferably the screen line. And then we also made some tally sheets of what those might look like for volunteers. And all of this is in the guidebook. Okay, so where to count? So with your PTRs, we made the recommendations of assigning specific locations. You want to do it at each factor group, and again, this report goes into more detail about the different factor groups for bicycling, but I sort of alluded to it: recreation, commute, and then what we refer to as mix, so 3 factor groups, and so you'd want to have a permanent counter at each of those, and then with permanent PTRs, you want to choose moderate volume expected locations. You don't want to go to the very, very busy locations, and you don't want to go to the not busy locations. You want to be somewhere in the middle, or kind of more toward the high. And you want to choose bottleneck areas, which is sort of hard to distinguish that out because usually bottlenecks are going to be naturally higher volumes. But the main idea there is not the bottleneck that's the highest, but it's sort of representative bottlenecks. And then you have some equipment requirements. With your coverage counts, on the other hand, you want to try and have as much randomness as possible. So I'm just going to go through an illustration of how that might be done. You want to be at the different factor groups again. You want to have a variety now with your short duration counts. You want to get the spectrum from low to high, and we had some pilots communities as part of this project, and they told us that was a challenge they faced was counting at low volume areas felt like the volunteers were wasting their time. Why did you have me go there? There was only like 4 people that came the whole time. But that's important to know. You can make some assumptions and say, well, those are going to be 0 to 10, and so you can make that assumption. But anything, 50 to 100, or around 50, 30 bicyclists a day, we still would want to count that. Okay, then you want to do it in quadrants. My example is going to go through that. And so here's the goal that we set in this report for Washington, to essentially match the automobile counting. So 3,600 locations, and to rotate it at 1,200 per year. And in order to make that possible for the state of Washington, again, I haven't looked at Idaho, but for the state of Washington, what that came down to was about 10% of your roadway miles. So you can figure this out quite easily. I mean, because the question is, how many counts should I do in my small community? Should I base that on population, or in the end, it might just be how many volunteers you can get. But to be sort of systematic as a statewide goal, what we said was you count up how many road miles you have. And Pullman, Washington is about the same as Moscow, Idaho, 84. So you have 84 roadway miles, and so about 10% of that, more or less 8. And then you'd want to do that then every year for a 3-year rotation, so you get 24 locations. And so then larger cities like Seattle, they're getting 500 locations. And that might seem shocking, but Seattle actually does that. They're getting about 150 locations a year in Seattle with either volunteers or with portable tubes. So let's just give a little example. Here's Moscow, Idaho. And Moscow was counting at these locations, and they were counting at them year after year after year. And I'm trying to express to them that they shouldn't do that, and they were sort of stuck in this idea. Well, we want to count at the same location every year because we want to see trends year to year, and that just makes me go crazy every time I hear that from other communities as well. You cannot do that. It is not possible to count for 2 hours on a Thursday in October and come back the next year and think that there's some trend that was happening. And in fact, as we look through Washington, the state of Washington, and they have 42 communities that are counting, and all of the communities in Washington, often we saw their reports, and they would have these reports talking about, the multiple locations that showed an increase, and they were really proud. Well, that's because we put it in these bike lanes and everything, and then other locations where there was a decrease, and now they have to explain away that. You can't just say, well, it was working there, but here it wasn't working because, and they have some story to it. They have to try and explain it. The fact is, you just can't do it. It's not possible to do a short duration count and compare it year to year. So I'm going to go through and talk about what needs to be done, and it has to do with PTRs. This phenomenon, in fact, is so common, it has a name. They call it the meat sale effect, because essentially you don't know if this big group of bicyclists or pedestrians or whoever are just going to the grocery store because there was a meat sale going on. So, okay, so let's talk about what Moscow should be doing, and what they're now doing is first determine your counts. And so in this case, we'd want to get roughly about 9 per year. So that'd be about 30 locations over a 3-year period. And so the color scheme's not really good, but this city's divided here into 3 different colors. There's a color here, and a color here. And, you could just base it on your local knowledge. And so this is the university area and 2 residential areas. And then in that, we go through and look for locations. Since we've got 3 areas, we essentially would want to have and since there's 9 squares, we'd essentially want about 1 location in every tier. So this is, by the way, a key concept here is we're looking for is, to make these things statistically viable, is randomness and stratification. And so we have strata here of we actually have 3 strata. We have strata by area, and then we have strata by the travel pattern, and then we have strata by expected volume. And so then that creates 3 boxes of 3 by 3. And so we would want to have roughly 10 in each box, which comes down to about 1 in each cell. And so we go through, we pick these locations, and in the end, you can see sometimes we didn't fill a cell, and sometimes we did, and that's just the nature of your local needs. In fact, as expected, we probably find that communities are more interested in counting high-level areas, so you see there's a little bit higher levels, some of the cells that are higher. Okay, and yeah, so this was by volume is what we recommended in the book, but if you don't know that expected volume, you could stratify it by path, arterial, collector, or local, so that's by street type or street function. Okay, and then now we need to say, well, we've got these 30 locations, and here's another introduction of randomness, is that we're going to now not count all 30 locations because we only get about 10 volunteers a year. So we're going to do 10 locations a year, so we're going to divide this out by over a 3-year period. So we just use this function from Excel and assign each location. So this is the location number, and we say, all right, this is going to be year 1, year 2, year 3, and then we're going to proceed with that program over a 3-year period. Okay, so is this perfectly statistical in terms of what we need for statistical analysis? No, but it's definitely much better than the way things were done in the past. Okay, next step is we'll adjust with our PTRs, and Moscow actually doesn't have any PTRs, so we'd have to look at neighboring PTRs, like maybe another city or another community, or there's also, you can get generic adjustment factors as well. This report has some generic adjustment factors, but the closer and the more PTRs that you have, the better. So in this case, we'd actually like to have 3 PTRs, one that's on a commuter type facility, one that's on a recreational facility, and one that's on something mixed. And the more likely thing is it's probably going to be on a path, so it's probably going to be recreational. So that's a reality because of money constraints, but all things possible, let's get 3 PTRs on 3 different facilities. But by the way, I should take a moment. Does anyone have any questions as I'm going through here? I know we've all eaten, it's the afternoon, I don't want to fall asleep. Yes?
So if I live in a community that's 3,000 people, so we're not significantly huge. I think the statistic is we have 26 miles of roadways, like
Oh.
interacting community.
Good.
But there's never been any measurement type done for pedestrians and bicyclists in any variety. So if I'm understanding this correctly, we want to look at, if we were going to try and attempt to do this, we would want to look at a data location on an arterial, a data location on a collector, and a data location on a residential, and just kind of randomly pick them as a community. Because we're not that huge, but you would want to do 2 a year in each of those areas, or relative to the size of our community?
That's right. So for your community, so that would be about 3 locations a year. Okay, and so that's about 9 locations total. But if you can get more volunteers, do more. If you have portable counters, do more. But we wanted to not put a lot of pressure on communities, and so that's how we set this goal. And again, this was kind of based on a statewide goal to get 3,600. But it's probably a good number to work with. So let's say you got 10 locations total, but you're going to rotate it. You're going to do 3 a year, or about 3 a year. And yes, statistical validation, we'd want it to be completely random. So what would that mean? That'd mean open up a GIS and having the attributes and then running some random thing, and it just picks these locations that you never even thought of. Is that going to happen? Probably not. Probably more likely what will happen is you'll pick maybe 25 candidate locations. That would be good, that one would be good, that one would be good, that would be good. So you got 25 locations. And then now you say, let's just pick 10 random of those ones, right? So it's kind of quasi-random. Okay, now you've got the random 10 locations, and then now make it random on how you're going to count those each year. So you're going to count about 3 or 4 locations a year, and do that every year, and that would be a really good program. Yeah. Okay, remember that? Well, if you do all this, then that goes away, and we can happily begin to do some trend analysis. So you've got some PTRs that are going to adjust your factors, and hopefully you've got PTRs over a couple years, and then you can have what's a growth factor, and then with that growth factor, you can make an adjustment and begin to see trend analysis. But until then, it's not possible. And even still, this isn't going to be perfect. It's just going to be an estimate, but it's just a much better estimate. So let's just look Wow, I got 5 minutes left, so I got to fly through here. This is Moscow's car program. They've got 4 permanent PTRs and then 340 locations that they count. So go ask your local public works director how many counts they do, and you'll be surprised that most communities are counting a lot for cars, but nothing for bikes. So let's hope we can increase that. So my last 5 minutes, which I think I can do, I'm just going to talk about this web page that we created for this project, which is I probably should have started with it because it's the most exciting thing that we did. So this is a place where communities can take their counts and they upload them to this web page. They just click on this thing, and the thing that they're uploading is like a spreadsheet like this, and it's like location ID, description, assumed type of count, latitude, longitude, year, month, and the count. So it's pretty basic. You do it in a spreadsheet, and then you upload it, and hit execute. And then after it takes about for a city the size of Moscow, it takes about 4 minutes. So you're sitting there waiting, but after 4 minutes, it then maps that data. So what did it do? It created. It took the counts, which were short duration. It went to a database of PTR, of bicycle PTRs. And I made this for the state of Washington, but as soon as we can get online Boise's PTRs, I'll feed it right in, and then this can start being used in Idaho and down here. It actually can be still used down here because I have in there a generic set of adjustment factors as well. It adjusts for those points, and so that's what you're seeing. But then it also adjusts for, then it does what's called a spatial extrapolation throughout the entire network of the counts. You can then download this and then open it up in GIS. And if you open it up in GIS, you can look at the specifics of all of the data that it makes. Let me just get through this. Let me just tell you really quick how it works. It estimates so recall with cars it's AADT. Well, with bikes it's AADB. And it does that using PTR data. And then it downloads the network from OpenStreetMap. It also connects to the U.S. Census to get a set of origins. It connects to Google Places. This is why it takes about 5 minutes for this whole thing to run. And then it routes from every origin to every destination to get what we're calling an expected flow. And then it uses that expected flow to extrapolate. It's like, imagine you have this river system and you have gauges at certain locations. So you have these 30 locations that have been gauged, and now you have a flow through that where you just adjust, well, if that was observed there, then we can use a proportion that would be throughout the whole network. And so it's a way to estimate AADB throughout the whole network. And so I'll come to a conclusion now that this guidebook is hopefully has some useful information for your community, some background on counting, the importance of using PTRs, and then this webpage also is something useful. It's if you're interested in it, I can get the URL is not available at the moment because we're still finalizing it all. But when it's available, it can be used in any state. It actually will go faster in Washington because I have things cached in the database. So probably for an Idaho place, it would take almost double the time. But it'll be available for anywhere in the country. And I think that's the end for me. So. All right.
So we'll have about 15 minutes while we walk down 8th Street to the counters to chat as well. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them now, but then also we'll have plenty of time to chat. I guess I probably should have mentioned who I was when I introduced our session today. My name's Tom Laws. I'm a comprehensive planner with the city of Boise. But I've been working on bicycle and pedestrian counts for quite a few years now. Prior to being at the city, I started the bicycle and pedestrian count program at Compass. And prior to that, I was working at Yosemite, Sequoia, and Kings Canyon National Parks, counting visitors on trails all throughout the parks and trying to figure out where people are going and where to best use funds within the national parks. But today I'm going to be wearing my volunteer hat, and that's representing the Treasure Valley Cycling Alliance, who is a nonprofit advocacy group supporting bicycling all throughout the Treasure Valley here in Boise and Ada County and Canyon County. And so what I wanted to talk about is that manual count program side, and really what we do for manual counts and what you potentially can do in your own communities. So just out of curiosity, how many of you are aware of a counting program in your community back home? Raise your hands. All right. If you don't have one, how many of you here are interested in starting a program? Got one in the back, great. So the goal of this presentation then is, one, hopefully for those of you who have a counting program, you can take a few things and best practices that we do here. And if you don't, hopefully this will plant the seed on how you can do it and really how easy it is. So I'll start just talking about manual counts. And then go through our methodology, how we choose sites, volunteers, recruiting, and so forth. Really, the major advantages with manual counts compared to the permanent counters that Duane will be talking about afterwards are, one, you're able to get turning movements and really look at that, was a 12-point intersection, 16-point intersection, where your traditional manual count or your traditional automated count really struggles being able to count more than just the throughput one direction or two directions. And so with manual counts, you're able to have a volunteer sit on the intersection and really look at every direction people are moving. You're also able to look at things like demographics and behaviors. So where do we have wrong way riders, or if it's at nighttime, you can have them be tracking lights, no lights, roughly what the age is, what the gender is, different things like that. Manual counts are cheap. They're free typically with a strong group of volunteers, and they're flexible where you can have them at almost any location, any time of day, any day a month, and so forth. Some of the disadvantages, like Mike mentioned, it's typically a 2-hour window. We really don't recommend any more than 3 hours. Try to stick to that 2 hours because it's a lot to ask for someone to sit on a corner, dealing with busy traffic and so forth for a long amount of time. And then you are dealing a lot of times with volunteers. And so, we do see a percentage of ours that will be no-shows or will fill out the forms incorrectly and so forth. So you have to be just be aware of that throughout this process. For site selection, I know we really look at 3 different ways, and I know Mike's going to cringe a little bit, but our first is with that baseline. So where have we counted in the past? And there's a few locations that we'll try to do year in, year out. So your typical main streets, your trailheads. For us, it's like 8th and Main right downtown, different areas where we know we have a lot of use. We know that it's a very visible location. We see bikes a lot, and so we've been counting for years as well and try to continue those counts. 2 others are, where do we have gaps in the network that we know we have some needs? So do we have locations where we really want counts to help justify new infrastructure improvements, where a bike lane ends or a sidewalk ends, things like that? And also, where do we have locations where we know we're going to get infrastructure in the future? So if we have a bike lane coming, let's try to get counts out there this year to see what that baseline is. And then hopefully when we come back, we can compare those and see, was it a success? Are we seeing more riders and so forth? This is just an example of the table that we have at TVCA. So we've been doing manual counts since 2007, and for every time that we have a location, we enter it into the spreadsheet. And then for each year, this is just the total counts that we had during that time. But you can divide it up a dozen different ways, looking at AM versus PM, weekday, weekend, things like that. But this is really just a way for us to track every location that has been counted in the past. And so when we do get a request for some of our data, we're able to look here and see, do we have counts in there? And if so, how long ago was that? When to count, really, any time is a good time to count. And that's really what we try to stress, any location, any time. But what we've found is we really aim for 2 different count cycles, one in May and one in September. So spring and fall. We just wrapped up our count session last week, and this is here just a graph from the University of Portland that looks at the percentage of air that you're likely to deal with throughout different months. And really what it's showing is that May through September window, you have your best chance of getting an accurate count. When you start getting into the fall, winter months, you have more chance for rain and snow and factors that might really skew what is the average actual count. For days of the week, we also try for that Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday for your commute trips, and then a Saturday for your more recreational-based trips, and really staying away from those Mondays, Fridays, and Sundays, which once again can have bigger fluctuations, bigger variables there. When to count during times of day, we recommend for our volunteers, a 2-hour window in the morning, 7 a.m. to 9 a.m., and then in the evening, 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. to try to check those commute times at least. But what this graph shows, this is coming from the University of Minnesota and Minnesota DOT, is it's your commute trends for on the top being vehicular trips, where there's really a clear trend for vehicular trips commuting Monday through Friday. And so you have a big peak in the morning, and then it kind of dives down in the afternoon, and then it peaks up again in the evening as people are headed home. The bottom one is showing what they found for bicyclist trips, and here it's really much more variable. You have people with alternate commute times, you have people that might be working alternate schedules, or and so with that, what I wanted to stress here is that really, once again, any time's a good time to count, but really the importance is try to be consistent. So if you are counting 7 to 9 one year, encourage your volunteers to do that the same the next. So for recruiting, we have a couple different strategies, starting with staff. So if you're going to be a city or a nonprofit organization, really make sure that your board, your core group is involved and they're committed as well. So getting them out there. Interns, and then also with that, teaming up with schools. We've both worked with high schools and then college students as well. Wouldn't recommend any younger than high school kids, just because it's hard to get their attentions for 2 hours at a time to make these counts. One example is we teamed up with Boise State University this past fall in their service learning program to have a couple students come and count 2 streets downtown, all throughout about a 10-block radius, to try to get a better understanding of where bicyclists are going throughout our downtown, really. Where are they turning? And it was unrelated to the count side, but we also had them look at our bicycle parking downtown. So do we have a location where we're seeing a lot of bikes going through that we might only have one rack or no racks, to try to figure out best locations to install a few more of those. Really support your current volunteers. So if you have an existing group, have a after count party celebration. Really show your thanks. One thing that we have, it's kind of waned in the past, but we really try to show what are the results of these counts. So you spend 2 hours, and then in a lot of cases you never hear what happens with those. Well, what we've been trying to do is tie them back. So if you have a location where infrastructure is coming after that's installed or during it's installed, really highlighting to our volunteers that, hey, you played a role in this, and this data was being used by the city, by ACHD, and so forth. And then other nonprofit groups and clubs that are also, in line, your health groups, your other bicycle groups in town. Bike shops have been big supporters of these counts in the past. But get creative. There's a lot of opportunities out there that you can look into for volunteers. So for our volunteer page, it's pretty straightforward. We do have a page on our website, but for the most part, we're using Facebook events, and then this is a Google Drive application that they go to fill in their information. And what that looks like is this process here. So we have a form where they provide their name, what date is going to work best for them, so AM or PM, and then we give the option, do you want to work close to work or close to home? And so with that, Google Drive will automatically upload that into the spreadsheet, and from there we'll manually then try to link our volunteers to a place close to where they're hoping to count, so we're not spreading them too far throughout the community. We also try to do a training for each one of these. So really, this is just a reminder of how to use the forms, what to count, what not to count, and then how to submit them afterwards. One of probably the biggest issues we have is getting the forms back. So people will, forget to scan them. It's a little easier now because we encourage people just to take a picture with their phone and send it into us that way. But in the past, we'd get them scanned, emailed, mailed to us, a variety of different things. And that kind of ties back to also having that celebration party at the end. That could be your opportunity to really encourage people to get their forms in. This is just an example slide that we walked through, so highlighting, really what you should be counting, what different forms count as bicyclists, pedestrians, and having different topics like this throughout that training application or training session can really make sure it's crystal clear throughout whoever your volunteers are. So I mentioned that there's a variety of additional things that you can do with manual counts, and really it's really up to you what you want your volunteers to count. So in addition to just your general bicycles and pedestrians, things that we like to look at are helmets use, demographics. So I mentioned age, gender. You can sometimes assume, are they more of a recreational trip or is it really more of a commute trip? Pedestrians, wrong-way riders, and so forth. And then here are just kind of 3 different examples of what these field sheets look like. So the first one on your left is the one that we currently use, and this is really meant for that intersection where you're getting all the movements, all 12 movements. The center one is one that allows you to count both bicyclists and pedestrians, so you can kind of see there's a line divided for each one of these, and so you just simply do a tally mark on the top and the bottom if it's a bike or a ped. We do this as well, but we tend to just use the center of the square, which isn't great, so I think we'll probably be updating this in the future, but just wanted to include that as an example. And the third one is one of those screen line counts. So if you're looking at an intersection or not an intersection, but just a location where you just need to know east, west, north, south, this is an example of the form that it actually calls out bikes, peds, but then also that gender, male or female. And then afterwards, this is what we get. And so this is also one of the downsides is we get a stack of manual hard copies or screenshots from phones, and then from here we have to take each one of these tallies and enter it into a spreadsheet. And so depending on how many volunteers you have, it can be pretty time consuming. And so with that, what we're looking into now is going into the digital age, getting rid of these hard copies, and the biggest app out there that seems to have quite a bit of success is through the Railroad Trail. It's called GoCounter. And what this will allow you to do is count anywhere, anytime, for any duration. One of our counts, we really try that 2-hour window. But here, if you're at a coffee shop and want to count for 5 minutes, you can open up the app and select, really what type of intersection or where are you looking at? Is it that streamline? Is it a 3-way? Is it a traditional 4-way intersection? And then all you have to do is, if you have a pedestrian going east-west, you just slide your finger over this way and it'll automatically tally a count. What's exciting about this, though, is that it will automatically take that data and then put it into a spreadsheet. So you have to completely skip that step of going through those copies and entering it yourself. And so we're looking and doing this and then also teaming up with our counterpart, Bike Walk Nampa, to really get a true Treasure Valley regional count program where anytime of day, any location, you can get out and do this. So I encourage you to take a look at this as well. The paper-based forms, those are great for the start, and so that I would recommend maybe seeing how those work out, but this is one thing that we're headed to in the future. Also, a great resource out there is from ITD, and this is really just it's a toolbox for bicycle and pedestrian counts, and it goes through everything you possibly want to know about how to start a counting program, what to look at, and then also have example of those forms that I showed you to pass out to your volunteers when you look into counts. I left all of the URLs on these, so when Cynthia uploads the presentations, you'll be able to access that as well. But I think this is 2013 that this came out, and it still holds true today. There's really a lot of good information in there, so I highly recommend checking this out if you're thinking of starting any count programs in your community. And with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Duane, who's going to now talk more about the portable, permanent, manual, or portable and permanent side of counters and what Compass is doing. So thank you, and Duane, go for it.
That was overwhelming. So my name is Duane Wakan. I am a principal planner at Compass, and so Compass, we are an organization that does long-range transportation planning, and Tom really was instrumental in getting the pedestrian counter and bike counter program started at Compass. So a lot of what I'm presenting to you today is really attributed to the efforts that were done by previous staff. So a little bit about Compass before we get into this, but we're a planning organization. We try to help our local agencies implement a long-range plan, a vision for the Treasure Valley. We provide hopefully a lot of technical expertise in terms of like GIS mapping. We do some travel demand modeling. We don't manage any traffic counts, but we do bike ped counting. We also are facilitators. We work with the communities. We bring everybody together, the stakeholders from across the region. And I see a few familiar faces out there who I work with on a regular basis to talk about planning in our region. We are an MPO. An MPO is a Metropolitan Planning Organization. Any populations over 50,000, you can start doing your own regional plans. So a lot of what I'm going to talk to you today is helping us with our planning efforts into the future. We like to prioritize funds and where they go. So if we can help provide good data, it leads to the good decisions. We do have a long-range plan at Compass. It's called Communities in Motion. We're going through an update right now. The four components of our plan really are focusing on roadways, the public transportation, our transit program, bicycle pedestrians, and freight. Okay, now into my topic. So today, I want to discuss with you what type of counters we have here at Compass. The outputs, we have to invest in time and money to get a counter program going, and then a little bit of how we use the data. And it was really good to hear Mike's presentation because it gives me some good ideas of what we should be doing and some course corrections in terms of how we might use our portable program. So in 2015, Compass started the bicycle and pedestrian counter program. Right now we have an inventory of 12 permanent counters that we have put along kind of green belts, pathways. We have 41 portable counters, which we will take out into the field, set up at all various locations. Usually how that happens is our member agencies who contribute to our plans, they request usually a site where they want a bike or ped count to take place. So we'll send somebody out into the field to go set up and monitor and then take down the count after. Here's a map of kind of what we have going on right now in the Treasure Valley. Our portable counters are our permanent counters are in the blue dots, and then the portables are where we've set things up in the Treasure Valley. Some of these are also reoccurring locations. So, but as we learn of these new tools that Mike has introduced, the spatial extrapolation features that programs are doing, we might need to now change our approach for our portables and get those out in random areas. So a little bit about permanent. So if you don't know anything about permanent counters, let me fill you in. That wooden pole right there has got an infrared detector which counts your pedestrians as they walk by. And then that inductive loop is kind of cemented into the ground, into the asphalt, and that counts our cyclists. And our permanent counters are automatically detecting both types of movement, and they can do the math and produce an output, which we will then take down and examine and look at. So there's some installation investments. If you're going to do a permanent count location, we have to contract out with a third party who will come in and kind of do the install process. It takes a couple hours to do. It's interesting to see how the entire process through. You can see after they've cut the asphalt on a trail, they're installing that inductive loop. They've installed the pedestrian counter, the wood post with the infrared detection. And that little green box you can see at the bottom of the of your left side is kind of the brains of the permanent counter. So we try to keep those kind of hidden a little bit. Sometimes they're buried. We don't want the public to go in and access those. But later on today, I'll try to show you some of the internal workings of what that looks like. Some of the cool outputs we get from our permanent counters, we can get daily averages, weekly profiles, peak hour movements. Now this is all kind of going up into the cloud. We don't have to do anything. We pay a fee for this service for every single permanent counter that we have out in the field. So our portables, we've got a few different types of pneumatic on-street counters. So this particular model that I'm showing you right now, you can see the pneumatic tubes that are stretching across the entire length of the street. We can collect speed and class for all vehicles, and in addition, grab our data for our cyclists. So these are really useful on kind of low-stress streets where you're not seeing a lot of traffic, neighborhood streets. We haven't really put one out on. We haven't put one out on like a super busy arterial, but we have other counters for that. So as you start examining your data with this type of pneumatic counter, you're obviously able to look at your bike versus your pedestrian or your cycling. We have some off-street pneumatic counters. These are tubes that which we'll lay out on different green belts or trails, hard surfaces. You can see this entryway into a park or to a school. So the cyclist will run over that tube, and then there's this little box. Work. That little box right there is counting our pedestrians. And so we set these up in combination if we want to capture both our pedestrian and cycling. We have some infrared counters that, once again, the box that's screwed to the pole. Some of these are really cool because they can count a pedestrian if you've got a trailhead and you're splitting your pedestrians on both sides of a pole. Some of our infrared counters can count both sides, but generally we've got a lot that just count one side of the trail. So we'll just set it up in the middle along the trail. We've had requests to install these on some corners, and it takes an additional staff time and some power, and tools that we didn't realize we were going to be needing at this. But so you're going to invest a lot of equipment to get these going. Here's some of the outputs that we have with our infrared counters. They are similar to the permanent counters. It's the same company that makes the permanent and some of these portable infrared counters. So the data can go up into the cloud. But we have to do some manual extraction before that can happen. But it's really nice because the reports we just download in PDF form, we send them out to our member agencies, and they use them for their own planning purposes. So really nice technology out there. We also have these infrared cameras that we set out, and these are kind of easy, low. They're only going to count. Well, they're not going to be able to distinguish between a pedestrian and a cyclist, but you're just going to get a total volume. You're not getting directional information like you would with some of our other technology. You're just going to get what's happening at that particular point. We have magnometer counters, and these are kind of like the inductive loops. These will detect a cyclist as they pass by. You can bury these in soft trails. You can mount them on a post, and it'll track some of just the bicycle activities that are happening. They're pretty much a low-cost investment, but I'll get to that later on. The outputs also are kind of nice because, as was spoken to by Mike, he talked about ADT and average annual daily traffic. These magnometer outputs will give us and break down that information for us. And then we also have time-lapse cameras. You can see one that's installed right there on 8th Street. I believe I helped Tom install that one. That was my first exposure to these cameras. They can be really flexible. We put them on trails. We put them anywhere where a portable counter wouldn't work, like a pneumatic tube isn't going to work in a certain situation. Sometimes if you don't set up your portable counters, some of the technology we have, a car can skew the data. It'll count it as a cyclist. And so you have to kind of know how to use these technologies. The cameras are nice because you set them up in situations, but you do have to sit after you've extracted the data. You're at your computer for a certain time looking at this information. We've talked about in our previous sessions about close calls when we try to monitor pedestrian movements. The cameras are really good for us to look at what's happening in terms of safety and maybe some behavioral issues at different intersections where we can start to, inform our member agencies, like, hey, you might want to consider doing something here because we see this pattern. Now, I don't personally delve into any of this. We have a staff person dedicated to the bike ped counter program, but as I was speaking to him about the time-lapse cameras, he saw a close call where he was cringing, closing his eyes. I mean, it was that close where he probably could have witnessed a fatality. Fortunately, that was not the case, but you can also see like ponding, like after a rainfall. Just little information like that where you will prohibit pedestrian movements because something's going on in the street, the curb and gutter. The outputs that we use for our cameras, we create ourselves. We just use a template, and then we kick something out that'll give us bidirectional and bike ped related. So we use the data for planning purposes. This is a trail that's in a planned trail in the city of Napa. And what's really cool is this trail is being planned, it's being expanded. Well, we have a permanent counter that we've set up on this trail in other locations, and now we see the expansion of this facility because they're using our numbers and trying to use that to extrapolate what will happen. our capital investments. If a local agency is wanting to really know how to spend money and the resources that are so limited, our accounts can really inform them and to make good decisions so they are investing money and building the right capital projects. And then for grants, we pursue grants at Compass. We have a staff who just walked by on the other side, but she is dedicated to helping our agencies find money to expand our bike ped program. And we're always looking for extra funds. We want more portables, we want more permanent counters. And so it's really cool to have this data. So just kind of a quick summary about what we have at Compass. So our permanent counters, there's a cost, right? It's not cheap. It's about $4,500 per permanent counter. They'll count both bicyclists and pedestrians. You'll get directional data. The cloud takes care of everything for us. Staff time in terms of our investment is really short. And, but there are other costs. We have to pay an annual maintenance fee just for that one counter every single year, about upwards to $400 per permanent counter. And batteries wear out, so we have to replace those. Sometimes a lawnmower hit one of our our permanent counters in the city of Kuna, so we had to replace our wooden post. But you can kind of see the breakdown of how we might invest some of our time and money. Some of the counters, like the magnometers and infrared counters, they're kind of intensive. Like you have to learn a lot just to be able to go out and put one out in the field and understand how the data works. So it's something, if you're going to invest in a counter program, know you're going to have to dedicate a staff person to do that if you want to make it truly successful. Anyways, that was my presentation in a nutshell. Do you guys have any questions for me or for any of the other panelists as we kind of end our time here?
Well, thanks, Duane.
Yeah.
So for next steps, we're going to be doing a little walking tour. So for those of you who would like, it'll be about 15 minutes, and what we're just going to do is walk all the way down 8th Street to the Greenbelt, and at the very end of 8th Street, we have a permanent counter there. Duane and Compass was nice enough to install a few other portable counters along the way, so we can stop and actually look at those. You can get inside, see how they work. And so we'll head down that way if you want to join us, and then we'll walk back over to George's and should get back there just in time for the party tonight. So thank you everyone for coming, and we look forward to seeing you on the walking tour.